theoretical basis of this yoga. This yoga has been widely affirmed. The following review does not profess to be exhaustive, for the literature relating to Kundalini and Laya Yoga is very great, but includes merely a short reference to some of the Upanishads and Puranas which have come under my notice, and of which I kept a note whilst engaged in this work. It will, however, clearly establish that this doctrine concerning the chakras, or portions of it, is to be found in other shastras than tantras, though the references in some cases are so curt that it is not always possible to say whether they are dealing with the matter in the same yoga sense as the work here translated, or as some forms of worship. It is to be noted in this connection that Bhuta Shuddhi is a rite which is considered to be a necessary preliminary to the worship of a deva. It is obvious that we understand the Bhuta Shuddhi to here mean the yoga practice described. Then, with the exception of the yogi expert in this yoga, no one would be competent for worship at all. For it is only the accomplished or Siddha yogi who can really take Kundalini to the Sahasrara. In the ordinary daily Bhuta Shuddhi, therefore, the process is purely a mental or imaginary one, and therefore forms part of worship or upasana and not yoga. Further, as a form of worship, the sadhaka may and does adore his Ishta Devata in various parts of his body. This again is a part of upasana. Some of the shastras, however, next mentioned, clearly refer to the yoga process, and others appear to do so. In what are called the earliest Upanishads, mention is made of certain matters, which are more explicitly described in such, and are said by Western Orientalists to be of later date. Thus we find reference to the four states of consciousness, waking, and so forth, the four sheaths, and to the cavity of the heart as a soul center. As already stated in the Indian schools, the heart was considered to be the seat of the waking consciousness. The heart expands during waking and contracts in sleep. Into it, during dreaming sleep, or swapna, the external senses are withdrawn, though the representative faculty is awake, until in dreamless sleep, or shushupati, it also is withdrawn. Reference is also made to the 72,000 nadis, the entry and exit of the prana through the Brahmarandra, that's above the foramen of Monro in the middle commissure, and up breathing through one of these nadis. These to some extent probably involve the acceptance of other elements of doctrine not expressly stated. Thus, the reference to the Brahmarandra and the one nerve, implying the cerebrospinal axis with its Shushumna, through which alone the prana passes to the Brahmarandra, for which reason apparently the Shushumna itself is referred to in the Shiva Samhita as Brahmarandra. Liberation is finally effected by knowledge, which, as the ancient Aitreya Aranyaka says, is Brahman. The Hamsa Upanishad opens with the statement that the knowledge therein contained should be communicated only with the brahmachari of peaceful mind, or shanta, self-controlled, or danta, and devoted to the guru, or guru bhakta. Narayana, the commentator who cites amongst other works the Tantric compendium, the Sharada Tilaka, describes himself as one whose sole support is Shruti. The Upanishad mentions by their names the 6 chakras, as also the method of raising the Vayu from the Muladhara, that is, the Kundalini Yoga. The Hamsa, that is, Jiva, is stated to be in the 8-petaled lotus below Anahata, where the Ishtadevata is worshipped. There are 8 petals, which are associated with certain vrittis. With the eastern petal is associated virtuous inclination. With the southeastern, sleep or nidra, and laziness, alsya. With the southern, boldness or cruelty, krura mati. With the southwestern, sinful inclination, pape manisha. With the western, various inferior or bad qualities, krida. With the northwestern, intention in movement or action, gamanadau buddhi. With the northern, attachment and pleasurable contentment, rati and priti. And with the northeastern petal, manual appropriation of things, dravya grahana. In the center of this lotus is dispassion or vairagya. In the filaments is the waking state, that's jagrad avastha. In the pericap, the sleeping state or swapna. In the stalk, the state of dreamless slumber, that's shushupti. Above the lotus is the place without support, which is the turiya state. The commentator Narayana says that the vritti of the petals are given in the Adhyatma Viveka, which assigns them to various lotuses. In the passage cited from the Hamsa Upanishad, they, or a number of these, appear to be collected in the center of meditation upon the Ishvadevata. In verse 9, 10 kinds of sound or nada are mentioned, which have definite physical effects, such as perspiration, shaking, and the like, and by practice of the 10th kind of nada, the Brahmapada is said to be attained. The Brahma Upanishad mentions in verse 2 the navel or nabhi, heart, that's hirdaya, throat, that's kantha, and head, murdha, as places where the 4 quarters of Brahman shine. The commentator Narayana says that the Brahma Upanishad, by the mention of these 4, indicates that they are the centers from which the Brahman may be attained. Reference is made to the lotuses at these 4 places, and the mind is spoken of as the 10th door, the other 9 apertures being the eyes, ears, nostrils, and so forth. The Dhyana Bindu Upanishad refers to the hearing of the Anahata sounds by the yogi in verse 3. The Upanishad directs that with Purukha, meditation should be done in the navel on the great powerful one with 4 arms, and of the color of hemp, that's Vishnu, with Kumbhaka, meditate in the heart on the red Brahma seated on a lotus, and with Rechaka, think of the 3-eyed one, that's Rudra, in the forehead. The lowest of these lotuses has 8 petals. The second has its head downwards, and the third, which is compounded of all the devatas, is like a plantain flower. In verse 13, meditation is directed on 100 lotuses with 100 petals each, and then on sun, moon, and fire. It is Atma which rouses the lotus, and taking the bija from it, goes to moon, fire, and sun. The Amritanada Upanishad refers to the 5 elements, and above them Ardha Mantra, that is, Agnya. These elements here are those in the chakras, for verse 26 speaks of the heart entrance as the aerial entrance. Above this, it is said, is the gate of liberation. It is stated in verse 25 that Prana and Manas go along the way the yogi sees, which the commentator says refers to the way Prana enters and departs from Muladhara and so forth. He also gives some hatha processes. The Shurika Upanishad speaks of the 72,000 nadis and of Ida, Pingala, and Shushumna. All these, with the exception of Shushumna, can be served by Dhyana Yoga, that's in verse 8, directs the sadhaka to get into the white and very subtle nada, and to drive pranavayu through it. And Puraka, Rechaka, Kumbhaka, and Hatha processes are referred to. The commentator Narayana on verse 8 remarks that Kundalini should be heated by the internal fire and then placed inside the Brahmanadi, for which purpose the Jalandhara Bandha should be employed. The Narasimha Purvata Payani Upanishad in chapter 5 verse 2 speaks of the Sudarshana, which is apparently here the Muladhara, changing into lotuses of 6, 8, 12, 16, and 32 petals respectively. This corresponds with the number of petals as given in the work, except as to the second. For taking this to be the Swadhisthana, the second lotus should be of 10 petals. Apparently this divergence is due to the fact that this is the number of letters in the mantra assigned to this lotus. For in the 6-petaled lotus is the 6-lettered mantra of Sudarshana. In the 8-petaled lotus, the 8-lettered mantra of Narayana. And in the 12-petaled lotus, the 20-lettered mantra of Vasudeva. As in the case ordinarily, in the 16-petaled lotus are the 16 kalas, that is, here vowels, sounded with Bindu or Anuswara. The 32-petaled lotus, Agnya, is really 2-petaled because there are 2 mantras here, each of 16 letters, of Narasimha and his Shakti. The 6th chapter of the Maitri Upanishad speaks of the nadis, and in particular of the Shushumna, the piercing of the mandalas sun, moon, and fire, each of these being within the other, sattva in fire and in sattva achyuta, and of Amana, which is another name for Unmani. Both the Yoga Tattva Upanishad and Yoga Shika Upanishad refer to Hatha Yoga, and the latter speaks of the closing of the inner door, the opening of the gateway of Shushumna, and the piercing of the sun. The Ramatapanya Upanishad refers to various yoga and tantric processes such as asana, dwara puja, pitta puja, and expressly mentions bhutta shuddhi, which, as above explained, is the purification of the elements in the chakras, either as an imaginative or real process by the aid of Kundalini. I have already cited in the notes numerous passages on this yoga from the Shandila Upanishad of the Atharva Veda, the Vahara and Yoga Kundalini Upanishads of the Krishna Yajur Veda, the Mandala Brahmana Upanishad of the Shukla Yajur Veda, and the Nada Bindu Upanishad of the Rig Veda. The great Devi Bhagavata Purana mentions in a full account the 6 chakras or lotuses, the rousing of Kundalini in the Muladhara by the manner here described, uniting Jiva therewith by the Hamsa mantra. Bhuta Shuddhi, the dissolution of the gross tattvas into the subtle tattvas, ending with Mahat in Prakriti, Maya in Atma. The Dhara Mandala is mentioned, and it and the other mandalas are described in the manner here stated. The bijas of Prithvi and other tattvas are given. Allusion is also made to the destruction of the man of sin, in terms similar to those to be found in the Mahanirvana and other tantras. A remarkable Dhyana of Prana Shakti is to be found in this chapter, which reads very much like other, which is given in the Prapanchasara Tantra. Linga Purana, Part 1, mentions the chakras with their different petals, the names of which are given by the commentator. Shiva is Nirguna, it says, but for the benefit of men he resides in the body with Uma, and yogis meditate upon him in the different lotuses. The Agni Purana, which is replete with tantric rituals, magic, and mantras, also refers to the Bhuta Shuddhi rite wherein, after meditation with the respective bija mantras on the navel, heart, and Agnya centers, the body of the sadhaka is refreshed by the flow of nectar. Finally, an adverse critic of this yoga, whom I cite later, invokes the authority of the great Shankara, though in fact, if tradition is correct, it is against him. Shankara, in whose maths may be found the great tantric yantra called Sri Chakra, says in his commentary on verse 9 and 10 of chapter 9 of the Bhagavad Gita. First, the heart lotus, that's Anahata, is brought under control. Then, by conquering Bhumi, and by the upward going Nadi, after having placed Prana between the 2 eyebrows, the yogi reaches the lustrous, light-giving Purusha. On this, the Tika of Anandagiri runs, by the Shushumna Nadi between Ida and Pingala. The throat is reached by the same way, the space between the eyebrows. By conquering earth, or Bhumi, is meant the process by which the 5 bhutas are controlled. Sridhara Swami says, by the power of yoga, prana must be led along the Shushumna. And Madhusudana Saraswati says, the upward going Nadi is Shushumna, and the conquest of Bhumi, and the rest is done by following the path indicated by the Guru. And by the space between the eyebrows is meant the Agnya Chakra. By placing prana there, it passes out by the Brahmarandra, and the jiva becomes one with the Purusha. The famous hymn called Ananda Lahiri, that's Wave of Bliss, which is ascribed to Shankara, deals with this yoga, and in the 13th chapter of Vidyaranya's Shankara Vijaya, the 6 lotuses are mentioned, as also the fruit to be gained by worshipping the Devata in each chakra. Pandit R. Ananta Shastri says, many a great man has successfully worked the Kundalini to the Sahasrara and effected her union with the Sat and Chit. Of these stands foremost and great and far-famed Shankaracharya, a humble pupil of one of the students of Gauda Padacharya, the author of the well-known Subhagaudiya. Having well acquainted himself with the principles contained in this work, Sri Shankaracharya received special instructions based upon the personal experience of his guru, and adding his own personal experience to the above advantages, he composed his famous work on the Mantra Shastra, consisting of 100 shlokas, the first 41 of these forming the Ananda Lahiri, and the rest forming the Sundarya Lahiri. The latter apostrophizes the Devi as being one who is beauteous from head to foot. Ananda Lahiri may be said to contain the quintessence of the Samayacharya. The work is all the more valuable because the author teaches it from personal experience. Lengthy commentaries are written on almost every syllable of the text. The value attached to the work may be adequately understood by the following theory. Some hold that Shiva is the real author of Ananda Lahiri, and not Shankaracharya, who was but a mantradastra or rishi, that is, one who realized the process and gave it to the world. No less than 36 commentaries on the work are now extant. Among them we find one written by our great Apaya Dikshita. The commentaries are not entirely different, but each has its own peculiar views and theories. As for the text of Ananda Lahiri, it contains 41 slokas. According to some commentators, the slokas are 35 in number. Some recognize only 30. And according to Sudha Vidyotani and others, only the following slokas constitute the text of Ananda Lahiri: 1 and 2, 8 to 9, 10 to 11, 14 to 21, 26 to 27, 31 to 41. In my opinion, also, the last statement seems to be correct, as the other slokas treat only of prayogas, that's applications of mantras, for worldly purposes. Only a few of these prayogas are recognized by all the commentators, while the rest are passed over as being entirely karmic. As has been remarked already, Ananda Lahiri is but an enlargement of the work called Subhagaudiya by Gaudapada, who is the guru of the author's guru. That work gives only the main points, without any of the characteristic admixture of illustrations above noticed. Of all the commentaries on Ananda Lahiri, Lakshmi Dhara's seems to be the most recent. Yet in spite of this, it is the most popular, and with reason too. Other commentaries advocate this or that aspect of the various philosophical schools, but Lakshmidhara collates some of the views of others and records them side by side with his own. His commentary is in this way the most elaborate. He sides with no party. His views are broad and liberal. All schools of philosophers are represented in his commentaries. Lakshmidhara also commentated on many other works, on Mantra Shastra, and is consequently of much higher repute. So his commentaries are as valuable to both Ananda Lahiri and Saundarya Lahiri as Sayanas are to the Vedas. Lakshmidhara seems to have been an inhabitant of southern India. The observances and customs he describes all point to this conclusion. The illustrations he adduces smack invariably of the south, and even to this day his views are more followed in the south than in the north. He has also written an elaborate commentary on Gaudapada's Subhadgodya. The references to that in the commentary to this work, and in the commentator's apology here and there for repeating what he has written on the former occasion, lead to the inference that the author had for his life work the commentary on the original book. Achyutananda's commentaries are in Bengali characters, and are followed as authority in Bengal, even to this day. Various commentaries are followed in various places, but few have risen to be universally accepted. There are only 3 or 4 works treating of Priya Yoga. I have had access to all of them, but here I have followed only one of them as being the most prominent and important. It comes from an ancient family in Conjeevaram. It contains 100 shlokas. The yantras for the mantras contained in the slokas, the different postures of the worshipper, and similar prescriptions are clearly described in it to the minutest detail. There seems to be some mystical connection between each shloka and its bija chakra, but it is not intelligible, nor has any of the prayoga kartas explained the same. The following is a list of commentaries written upon Ananda Lahiri. Some of them include Soundarya Lahiri also. 1. Manorama, a commentary. 2. A commentary by Apaya Dikshita. 3. Vishnu Pakshi. Perhaps this may be the same as number 14 given below. 4. By Kavira Jasharam, about 3,000 granthas. 5. Manju Bhushani by Krishnacharya, the son of Vallabhacharya, shlokas about 1,700. He says in his introduction that Shri Shankaracharya praised the Brahma Shakti called Kundalini when he was meditating on the banks of the Ganges. He gives the purport of this work in the first sloka. I praise constantly the Kundalini, who creates innumerable worlds continuously, though she is like a filament on the lotus, and who resides at the root of the tree, that's Muladhara, to be roused and led to Shasrara. This is popular in the Bengal Presidency. 6. Another commentary called Saubhagya Vardhana by Kavalya Asharma. The Adar Library has a copy of it. This is popular throughout India, so we can get as many of the same as we require from different places. It contains about 2,000 granthas. 7. By Keshavabhata. 8. Tattva Dipika by Gangathari, a small commentary based on Tantra Shastra. 9. By Gangadhara. 10. By Gopi Ramana Takara Pravanachana, granthas about 1,400. Seems to be of recent origin. 11. Gaurikanta Sarvabhauma Bhattiya Charya, granthas about 1,300 of recent origin. 12. By Jagadisha. 13. By Jagannatha Panchana. 14. By Narasimha, granthas 1,500. The chief peculiarity of this commentary is that it explains the text in 2 different ways. each shloka being applicable to Devi and Vishnu at the same time. Though some commentators have given different meanings to some of the verses, yet all of them apply to the different aspects of Devi alone, and not to the different devatas. 15. Bhavarta Deepa by Brahmananda. Granthas about 1700. 16 by Malabhata. 17 by Mahadevya Vidya Vagisha. 18 by Madhava Vaida. 19 by Ramachandra. Granthas about 3000. 20 by Ramananda Irtha. 21 Lakshmidhara, which is well known to the public and needs no comment. This has been brought out excellently in Devi Nagara type by the Mysore government lately. 22 by Vishwambhara. 23 by Shrikanta Bhatta. 24 by Ramasuri. 25 by Dindima. 26 by Ramachandra Mishra. Granthas about 1000. 27 by Achyutananda. 28 by Sadashiva. 29 another nameless commentary. 30 by Shringadasa. 31 by Govinda Tarka Vagisha, Bhattacharya. Granthas 600. He seems to give the yantra also for each verse. Further he says the god Mahadeva specially incarnated as Shankaracharya to promulgate the science of Sri Vidya. 32 Suddha Vidyotani by the son of Pravasana. This commentator says that the author of this famous hymn was his father, Pravasana, prince of the Dramidas. He tells us a story in connection with Pravasana's birth, which is very peculiar. As he was born in an inauspicious hour, Dramida, the father of Pravasana, in consultation with his wise minister, by name Sukha, threw him out into the forest, lest he, that's the father, should lose his kingdom. The child praised Devi by this hymn, and, pleased with it, the Devi fostered and took care of him in the forest. The story ends by saying that the boy returned to his father's dominion and became king. By his command, his son, the present commentator, wrote Suddha Vidyotani, after being fully initiated into this mystic shastra, Sri Vidya. The account, however, appears to be rather fantastic. This I got from South Malabar, with much difficulty. It gives the esoteric meaning of the verses in Ananda Lahiri, and seems to be a valuable relic of occult literature. 33. The Book of Yantras with Prayoga. This is very rare and important. Beside the above commentaries, we do not know how many more commentaries there are upon this hymn. The celebrity of Ananda Lahiri and the great number of commentaries upon it are proof of the widespread and authoritative character of the yoga here described. To conclude with the words of the commentator on the Trishati, it is well known in Yoga Shastras that nectar or amrita is in the head of all breathing creatures, and that on Kundalini going there by yoga path, which is moistened by the current of that nectar, yoginis become like Ishwara. The chakras, however, mentioned are not always those of the body above stated. as would appear from the following account, which it will be observed is peculiar, and which is taken from the Shat-chakra-Upanishad of the Atharva Veda. Apparently, reference is here made to cosmic centers in the worship of the Vishnu Avtara called Narasimha. Om, the Devas, coming to Satyaloka, thus spoke to Prajapati, saying, "Tell us of the Narasimha Chakra." To which he replied, "There are 6 Narasimha Chakras. The first and second have each 4 spokes, the third 5, the fourth 6, the fifth 7, and the sixth 8 spokes. These 6 are the Narasimha Chakras. Now what are their names? That is what you ask. They are Achakra, Sut-chakra, Mahachakra, Saklaloka Rakshana Chakra, Dhyana-chakra, Asuranta Chakra. These are their respective names. Now what are the 3 circles? These are the inner, middle, and outer. The first is Bija, the second Narasimha Gayatri, and the third, or outer, is Mantra. Now what is the inner circle? There are 6 such. These are the Narasimha, Mahalakshmiya, Saraswata, Kamadeva, Pranava, Krodhavata, that is Bijas, respectively. These are the 6 interior circles of the 6 Narasimha Chakras. Now what is the middle circle? There are 6 such. To each of these belong Narasimha, Vidme, Vajranakhya, Dhimahi, Tanha, Simha, Prachayodatya, respectively. These are the 6 circles of the 6 Narasimha Chakras. Now what are the 6 outer circles? The first is Anandatma, or Achakra. The second is Priyatma, or Suchakra. The third is Jyotir Atma, or Mahachakra. The fourth is Mayatma, or Sakala Loka Rakshana Chakra. The fifth is Yogatma, or Dhyana-chakra. And the sixth is Samapyatma, or Asura Taka Chakra. These are the 6 outer circles of the 6 Narasimha Chakras. Now where should these be placed? Let the first be placed in the heart, the second in the head, the third at the site of the crown lock, the fourth all over the body, the fifth in the eyes, and the sixth in all the regions. He who does Nyasa of these Narasimha Chakras on the 2 limbs becomes skilled in Anushtubh, attains the favor of Lord Narasimha, success in all regions and amongst all beings, and at the end, liberation. Therefore, should this Nyasa be done. This Nyasa purifies. By this one is made perfect in worship, is pious, and pleases Narasimha. By the omission thereof, on the other hand, the favor of Narasimha is not gained, nor is strength, worship, nor piety generated. he who reads this becomes versed in all Vedas, gains capacity to officiate as priest at all sacrifices, becomes like one who has bathed in all places of pilgrimage, an adept in all mantras, and pure both within and without. He becomes the destroyer of all Rakshas, Bhutas, Pishas, Shakinis, Pretas, and Vetalas. He becomes freed of all fear. Therefore should it not be spoken of to an unbeliever. Notwithstanding the universal acceptance of this yoga, it has not escaped some modern criticism. The following passage is a summary of that passed by an English-educated guru, from one of whose disciples I received it. It was elicited by the gift of the Sanskrit text of the works here translated. Yoga, as a means to liberation, is attained by entry to the doors of Jnana, that's knowledge, and Karma, that's action. Yoga is doubtless bliss, for it is the union of the Jivatma with the Brahman, who is bliss or Ananda. But there are various forms of bliss. There is, for instance, physical bliss, gross or subtle as it may be. It is a mistake to suppose that because a method of yoga procures bliss, it therefore secures liberation. In order that we be liberated, we must secure that particular bliss, which is the Brahman. Some centuries ago, however, a band of atheists, that's the Buddhists, discovered the doctrine of the void, that's Shunyavada, and by a false display of a new kind of Nirvana Mukti, locked up these two doors which gave entry to liberation. Today, these doors are secured by 3 padlocks. The first is the doctrine that by faith one attains Krishna, by where there is argument, or tarka, he is far away. The second is that the error of the Brahmos, who in Western fashion think that they can control the formless, changeless Brahman by shutting their eyes in church and repeating that he is the merciful, loving Father who is ever occupied with our good, and that if he be flattered he will be pleased, for worship is flattery. The third is the opinion of those to whom all religious acts are nothing but superstition, to whom self-interest is the only good, and whose pleasure it is to throw dust into the eyes of others and secure the praise of those whom they have thus blinded. Vishnu, in order to cause the disappearance of the Vedas in the Kali age, manifested as the atheist Buddha, and allowed various false doctrines, such as that of the Arhatas, to be proclaimed. Rudra was affected by the sin of destroying the head of Brahma. Then he began to dance, and a number of Uchchista, or low malignant Rudras, whose deeds are never good, issued from his body. Vishnu and Shiva asked each other, "Can we do these people any good?" Their partial manifestations then promulgated Shastras opposed to the Vedas, fitted for atheistic bent of their minds, that they might happily thereby rise through them to higher things. God fools the wicked with such scriptures, We must now, however, discriminate between Shastras. It is not because it is said in Sanskrit, Shiva says, that we should accept all which follows this announcement. All that is opposed to Veda and Smriti must be rejected. Of the enemies of the Vedas for whom such Shastras were designed, some become Vaishnavas and others Shaivas. One of such scriptures was the Tantra, with a materialistic yoga system called Shat-chakra-sadhana, which is nothing but a trickery on the part of the professional gurus, who have not hesitated also to promulgate forged scriptures. The very mention of Tantric Shastra fills us with shame. The Shat-chakra-sadhana is a mere obstruction to spiritual advancement. The bliss which is said to be attained by leading Kundalini to the Sahasrara is not denied, since it is affirmed by those who say they have experienced it. But this bliss, or Ananda, is merely a momentary superior kind of physical bliss, which disappears with the body, and not the bliss which is Brahman and liberation. Moksha is not to be got by entering the Sahasrara, but in leaving it by piercing the Brahmarandra and becoming bodiless. The Tantric seeks to remain in the body, and thus to obtain liberation cheaply, just as the Brahmos and members of the Arya Samaja have become Brahmajnanis, that is, knowers of the Brahman, at a cheap price. Nectar, too, is cheap with the Tantrics. But what is cheap is always worthless, and this shows itself when one attempts to earn some fruits from one's endeavors. And yet all men are attracted when they hear of Shat-chakra. Many are so steeped in Tantric faith that they can find nothing wrong with its Shastras. And the Hindu nowadays has been put in such a maze by his Tantric gurus that he does not know what he wants. For centuries he has been accustomed to the Tantric Dharma, and his eyes are therefore not clear enough to see that it is as truly unacceptable to a Hindu as it is to a Muslim. In fact, these persons, for whose benefit this guru makes these remarks, are full of mlechata, which is looked at with contempt. Though after all it must be admitted to be some advance for such a creature such as a mlecha to adhere even to Tantric doctrine. For bad as it is better than nothing at all. All the same, the gurus delude them with their fascinating talk about Shat-chakra. Like a lot of the present-day advertisers, they offer to show their so-called lotuses to those who will join them. Men are sent to collect people to bring them to a Diksha Guru, that's initiator. In this respect, the Tantrics act just like coolie recruiters for the tea gardens. The Tantric says there are really lotuses there, but if the lotuses are really there, why are we not told how we may see them? And there also are supposed to be devatas, dakinis, yoginis, all ready at every moment for inspection. And then how material it all is. They speak of Parashiva above Shiva, as if there was more than one Brahman. and then the nectar is said to be of the color of lac. Well, if so, it is a gross, that's stula, and perceptible thing. And as a doctor can then squeeze it out, there is no need for a guru. In short, the Tantric Shat-chakra is nothing but a sweet in the hands of a child. A child who is wayward is given a sweet to keep him quiet. But if he has sense enough to know that the sweet is given to distract him, he throws it away and finds the key to the locked doors of yoga, called karma and jnana. This process of yoga was expelled from Hindu society centuries ago. For nearly 2,500 years ago, Shankara, when destroying atheism, exterminated also Shat-chakra yoga. Shankara then showed the worthlessness of the tantras. They are again today attempting to enter Hindu society and must again be destroyed. The writer of that note, thus summarized, omitted to notice, or perhaps was unaware that the chakras are mentioned in the Upanishads, but endeavored to meet the fact that they are also described in the Puranas by the allegation that the Puranic chakras are in conformity with the Vedas, whereas the Tantric chakras are not. It is admitted that in the Shiva Purana there is an account of the 6 centers, but it is said that they are not there alleged to actually exist, nor is anything mentioned of any sadhana in connection with them. They are, it is contended, to be imagined only for the purpose of worship. In the external worship, devas and devis are worshipped in similar lotuses. The Puranas, in fact, according to this view, convert what is external worship into internal worship. If, according to the Purana, one worships an interior lotus, it is not to be supposed that there is anything there. One is worshipping merely a figment of one's imagination. Though it is curious to note that it is said that this figment secures certain advantages to the worshipper, and the latter must commence, according to this critic, with the chakra which he is qualified to worship. It is not obvious how any question of such competency arises when each of the chakras is imagined only. Attention is drawn to the fact that in the Linga Purana there is nothing but the rousing of Kundalini, the piercing of 6 centers, the drinking of nectar, and so forth. The Purana merely says, meditate on Shiva and Devi in the different lotuses. There is, it is thus contended, a radical difference between the two systems. In the Puranic description of the chakras, everything is stated clearly. But with the Tantric, all is mystery. Or else, how indeed, except by such mystification, could they dishonestly carry on their profession as gurus? Buddhists may dispute this critic's understanding of their Shunyavada, as Tantrics will contest his account of the origin of their Shastra. The historian will call in question the statement that Shankara abolished the Tantra. For according to the Shankara Vijaya, his action was not to abolish any of the sects existing at this time, but to reform and establish bonds of unity between them, and to induce them all through their differing methods to follow a common ideal. Thus, even though Krachaka was absorbed into his god, the extreme Tantric sects of Kapilakas, which he represented, is said to have continued to exist with Shankara's approval, though possibly in a modified form under its leader Vatu Kanatha. The Brahmos, Arya Samaja, Vaishnavas, and Shaivas may resent this critic's remarks, so far as they touch themselves. I am not here concerned with this religious faction, but will limit the following observations in reply to the subject in hand. The criticism, notwithstanding its pious acerbity against forms of doctrine of which the writer disapproved, contains some just observations. I am not, however, here concerned to establish the reality or value of this yoga method, nor is proof on either of these points available, except through actual experiment and experience. From a doctrinal and historical point of view, however, some reply may be made. It is true that karma and jnana are means for the attainment of moksha. These and bhakti, or devotion, which may partake of the character of the first or second according to the nature of its display, are all contained in the 8 processes of yoga. Thus, they include tapas, a form of karma yoga, and dhyana, a process of jnana yoga. As has been pointed out, the 8-limbed yoga, that's Ashtanga yoga, includes hatha processes such as asana and pranayama. What hatha yogis have done is to develop the physical or hatha processes and aspect. The true view of hatha vidya recognizes that it is an auxiliary of jnana, whereby moksha is obtained. It is also obviously true that all bliss is not moksha. Ananda, meaning bliss, of a kind may be secured through drink or drugs, but no one supposes that this is liberating bliss. Similarly, hatha yoga processes may secure various forms of gross or subtle bodily bliss which are not the bliss. There is, however, a misunderstanding of the system here described, when it is described as merely materialistic. It has, like other forms of yoga, a material side or hatha side, since man is gross, subtle, and spiritual. But it has a jnana aspect also. In all yoga there is mental exercise. As the jiva is both material and spiritual, discipline and progress in both the aspects is needed. Kundalini is aroused by mantra, which is a form of consciousness or chaitanya. It is he whose being is immersed in the Brahman who arouses the Devi Kundalini by mantra hamkara. That's verse 50. The Devi is herself Shuddha Sattva. The wise and excellent yogi, wrapped in samadhi and devoted to the lotus feet of his guru, should lead Kula Kundalini along with Jiva to her Lord, the Parashiva, in the abode of liberation within the pure lotus, and meditate upon her who grants all desires as the Chaitanya Rupa Bhagavati, that is, the Devi whose substance is consciousness itself. And as he leads Kula Kundalini, he should make all things absorb in her. meditation is made on every center in which she operates. In the Agnya center, Manas can only unite with and be absorbed into Kundalini by becoming one with the Jnana Shakti which she is, for she is all Shaktis. The Laya Yoga is therefore a combination of karma and jnana. The former mediately and the latter directly achieves moksha. In the Agnya is Manas and Om, and on this the sadhaka meditates. The sadhaka's Atma must be transformed into a meditation on this lotus. His Atma is the Dhyana of Om, which is the inner Atma of those whose buddhi is pure. He realizes that he and the Brahman are one, and that Brahman is alone real, that's Sat, and all else unreal, that's Asat. He thus becomes an Advaitavadi, or one who realizes the identity of the individual and universal self. The mind, that's Chetas, by repeated practice, Abhyasa, is here dissolved, and such practice is mental operation itself. For the yogi, meditating on the mantra whereby he realizes the unity of Prana and Manas, closes the house which hangs without support. That is, he disengages the Manas from all contact with the objective world in order to attain the Unmani Avastha. Here is Parama Shiva. The Tantric does not suppose that there are several Shivas in the sense of several distinct deities. The Brahman is one. Rudra, Shiva, Paramashiva, and so forth are but names for different manifestations of the One. When it is said that any devata is in any chakra, it is meant that that is the seat of the operation of the Brahman, which operation in its Daiva aspect is known as Devata. As these operations vary, so do the Devatas. The Hamsa of the Sahasrara contains in himself all Devatas. It is here, in the Agnya, that the yogi places at the time of death his prana, and enters the Supreme Purusha, who was before the three worlds, and who is known by the Vedanta. It is true that this action, like others, is accompanied by hatha processes, but these are associated with meditation. This meditation unites Kundalini and Jivatma with the Bindu, which is Shiva and Shakti, and the yogi after such union, piercing the Brahmarandra, is freed from the body at death and becomes one with Brahman. The secondary causal body, that's Karana Vantara Sharira, above Agnya and below Sahasrara, is to be seen only through meditation, when perfection has been obtained in yoga practice. Verse 40 refers to Samadhi Yoga. Passing to the Sahasrara, it is said, well concealed and attainable only by great effort is that subtle void or shunya, which is the chief root of liberation. In Paramashiva are united two forms of bliss, namely rasa or Paramananda rasa, that is the bliss of moksha, and virasa, or the bliss which is the product of the union of Shiva and Shakti. It is from the latter union that there arise the universe and the nectar which floods the lesser worlds, or the body. The ascetic, of pure mind, is instructed in the knowledge by which he realizes the unity of the Jivatma and Paramatma. It is that most excellent of men who has controlled his mind, that is, concentrated the inner faculties on the Sahasrara and has known it, who is freed from rebirth and thus attains moksha. He becomes Jivan Mukta, remaining only so long in the body as is necessary to work out the karma, the activity of which has already commenced, just as a revolving wheel will yet run a little time after the cause its revolving has ceased. It is the Bhagavati Nirvana Kala who grants divine liberating knowledge, that is, Tattva Jnana, or knowledge of the Brahman. Within her is Nityananda, which is pure consciousness itself, and is attainable only by yogis through pure jnana. It is this jnana which secures liberation. The Maya Tantra says, those who are learned in yoga say it is the unity of Jiva and Atma. According to the experience of others, it is the knowledge of the identity of Shiva and Atma. The Agamavadis say that knowledge of Shakti is yoga. Other wise men say that the knowledge of the Purana Purusha is yoga, and others say the Prakriti-vadyas declare that the knowledge of the union of Shiva and Shakti is yoga. The Devi, by dissolving Kundalini in the Bindu, effects the liberation of some sadhakas through her meditation upon the identity of Shiva and Atma in the Bindu. She does so in the case of others by a similar process and by meditation on Shakti. In other cases, this is done by concentration of thought on the Parama Purusha, and in other cases by the meditation of the sadhaka on the union of Shiva and Shakti. In fact, the worshipper of any particular devata should realize that he is one with the object of his worship. In pranava worship, for instance, the worshipper realizes his identity with the Omkara. In other forms of worship, he realizes his identity with Kundalini, who is embodied by the different mantras worshipped by different worshippers. In short, jnana is kriya jnana and swarupa jnana. The latter is direct spiritual experience. The former are the meditative processes leading to it. There is here kriya jnana, and when Kundalini unites with Shiva, she gives jnana swarupa, for her nature swarupa, as also his, is that. After union with Shiva, Kundalini makes her return journey. After she has repeatedly gone to him, she makes a journey from which, at the will of the yogi, there is no return. Then the sadhaka is Jivan Mukta, his body preserved until such time as the active karma is exhausted, when he can achieve bodiless or Kaivalya Mukti, that is, supreme liberation. The revered Lord Preceptor, that is, Shankaracharya, in his celebrated Ananda Lahiri, thus hymns her return. Kuharini, thou sprinklest all things with the stream of nectar which flows from the tips of thy 2 feet, and as thou returnest to thine own place, thou vivifiest and makest visible all things that were aforetime invisible, and on reaching thy abode, thou resumest thy snake-like coil and sleepest. That is, as her passage upward was laya-krama, meaning dissolution of the tattvas, so her return is shrishti-krama, meaning recreation of the tattvas. Verse 54 says that the yogi who has practiced yama and niyama and the like, meaning the processes of Ashtanga Yoga, including Dhyana with its resulting samadhi, and whose mind has thus been controlled, is never again reborn. Gladdened by the constant realization of the Brahman, he is at peace. Whether the method above described be or be not effectual or desirable, it must be obvious upon a perusal of the text, which gives an explanation of it, that the yoga which the author affirms to be the cause of liberation is not merely material, but that it is the arousing of the power of the world consciousness which makes man what he is. The yogi thus does claim to secure the bliss of liberation by making entry thereto through the doors of karma and jnana yoga. A Brahmo author who is so little favorable to the Tantra as to describe the difference between it and the Veda as being as great as that which exists between the netherworld and heaven, does not deny the efficiency of the Tantric Shat-chakra sadhana, but contrasts it with the Vaidika Gayatri sadhana in an account of the 2 methods, which I here summarize in inverted commas. The chakras, the existence of which is not disputed, are placed where the nerves and muscles unite. The Agnya is the place of the command. This manifests in the operation of buddhi. If the command is followed, the sadhaka becomes pure of disposition, meaning bhava, and speech. Speech displays itself in the throat, the region of Vishuddha. The next lower chakra is called Anahata because of its connection with nada, which is itself produced in the heart. The Vayu in Anahata is Prana Shakti. Here, when free from sin, one can see the Atma. Here the yogi realizes, I am he. Fire is at the navel. The seat of desire is at the root of the Swadhisthana. In the lowest lotus, the Muladhara, are the 3 Shaktis of Jiva, namely Ichcha, Kriya and Jnana, in an unconscious, unenlivened state. The sadhaka, by the aid of the Paratma as fire and air, awakens these 3 forces, and ultimately by the grace of Paratma he is united with the Turiya Brahman. In the days of old, sadhana commenced at the Muladhara chakra, that is, those who were not sadhakas of the Gayatri mantra commenced from below at the lowest center. There was a good reason for this, for thereby the senses, or indriya, were controlled. Without such control, purity of disposition cannot be attained. If such purity be not gained, then the mind, or chitta, cannot find its place in the heart. And if the chitta be not in the heart, there can be no union with the Paratma. The first thing, therefore, which a sadhaka has to do is to control the senses. Those who achieved this without fixing their minds on the Lord had to go through many difficult and painful practices, such as the mudras, bandhas, and so forth, which were necessary for the control of the indriyas and of the action of the gunas. All this is unnecessary in the Gayatri sadhana or method. It is true that the senses should be controlled in the lower three chakras, that is, cupidity in the Muladhara, lust in the Swadhisthana, at the root of the genitals, the anger at the navel. These three passions are the chief to set the senses in motion, and are the main doors to hell. The way, however, in which control should be effected is to place the chitta, or mind, on the sattva, or existence, of Paramatma in these chakras. The chitta should be taken to each of these lowest three centers and controlled, whereby these passions which have their respective places at those centers are controlled. Whenever, therefore, the senses get out of control, fix the chitta on the Paramatma in the particular chakra. To give the above an English turn of thought, if, say, anger is to be controlled, carry the mind to the navel, and there meditate upon the existence of the Supreme One in this center, not merely as the Supreme without body and within the body, but as embodied in that particular part, for that is its manifestation. The result is that the passionate activity of this center is subdued, for its functioning is attuned to the state of the Atma which informs it, and both the body and mind attain the peace of the Atma on which the self is centered. Having thus controlled the senses, the Gayatri sadhana commences, not at the lowest, but at the highest of the 6 centers, namely the Agnya between the eyebrows. There is no necessity for the different and painful processes of piercing the chakras from below. Fix the mind on the Lord, in the highest center. For the ether, or Akasha there, is the being of the Supreme Atma. There, and in the 2 lower centers, Vishuddha and Anahata, enjoyment is had with Ishvara. The union between Jiva and Prakriti is called honey in the Upanishads. By sadhana of the Agnya center, purity of being is attained, and purity of speech follows the attainment of such bhava. Yoga with the Supreme Devata, who is all-knowing, is had here. He who is freed from all disturbing conditions of body and mind reaches the state which is beyond the gunas, which is that of the Supreme Brahman. We may conclude these 2 criticisms with the true Indian saying, somewhat inconsistently quoted in the first, "To dispute the religion dharma of another is the mark of a narrow mind." O Lord, O great magician, with whatsoever faith or feeling we call on thee, thou art pleased. Whatsoever difference there has been, or may be, as to forms and methods, whether in Upasana or Yoga, yet all Indian worshippers of the ancient type seek a common and in unity with light of consciousness, which is beyond the regions of sun, moon, and fire. It will now be asked, what are the general principles which underlie the yoga practice above described? How is it that the rousing of Kundalini Shakti and her union with Shiva affects the state of ecstatic union, meaning samadhi, and spiritual experience which is alleged? The reader who has understood the general principles recorded in the previous sections should, if he has not already divined it, readily appreciate the answers here given. In the first place, the preceding section will have indicated that there are two lines of yoga, namely Dhyana or Bhavana Yoga and Kundalini Yoga, the subject of this work, and that there is a difference between these two. The first class of yoga is that in which ecstasy or samadhi is attained by intellective processes, kriya, jnana, of meditation and the like, with the aid, it may be, in the preliminary stage of auxiliary processes, of mantra or hatha yoga, that's other than the rousing of Kundalini Shakti, and by detachment from the world. The second is that yoga in which, though intellective processes are not neglected, the creative and sustaining Shakti of the body as Kundalini is actually and truly united with the Lord consciousness, so as to procure for the yogi a result which the jnana yogi directly gains for himself. The yogi makes her introduce him to her Lord, and enjoys the bliss of union through her. Though it is he who arouses her, it is she who gives jnana, for she is herself that. The Dhyana yogi gains what acquaintance and with the supreme state his own meditative powers can give him, and knows not the enjoyment of union with Shiva in and through his fundamental body power. The two forms of yoga differ both as to method and result. The Hatha Yoga, in search of Laya, regards his yoga and its fruit as the highest. The Jnana Yogi thinks similarly of his own. And in fact, Raja Yoga is generally regarded as the highest form of yoga. Kundalini is so renowned that many seek to know her. Having studied the theory of this yoga, I have often been asked whether one can get on without it. The answer of the Shastra is, it depends what you are looking for, and on your powers. If you want to rouse Kundalini Shakti to enjoy the bliss of union of Shiva and Shakti through her, which your capacities do not otherwise allow you to have, or if you wish to gain the accompanying powers or siddhi, it is obvious that this end can only be achieved by the yoga here described. But if liberation is sought, and the yoga has capacity to attain it without Kundalini, then such yoga is not necessary, for liberation may be attained by pure jnana yoga through detachment, the exercise, and then the stilling of the mind without any reference to the central bodily power at all. Indeed, perfect liberation, that's nirvikalpa samadhi, can only be attained in this way by Raja Yoga, of which Kundalini Yoga is a preliminary method. Samadhi may also be attained on the path of devotion or bhakti, as on that of knowledge. Indeed, the highest devotion, that's para-bhakti, is not different from knowledge. Both are realization. A Dhyana yogi should not neglect his body, knowing that as he is both mind and matter, each reacts the one upon the other. Neglect or mere mortification of the body is more apt to produce disordered imagination than a true spiritual experience. He is not concerned, however, with the body in the sense that the Hatha yogi is. It is possible to be a successful Dhyana yogi and yet to be weak in body and health, sick and short-lived. His body, and not he himself, determines when he shall die. He cannot die at will. The ecstasies which he calls liberation while yet living, that's Jivan Mukti, is not a stake like that of real liberation. He may be still subject to a suffering body, from which he escapes only at death, when he is liberated. His ecstasy is in the nature of a meditation, which passes into the void, that's bhavana samadhi, effected through negation of thought, that's chitta vritti, and detachment from the world, a process in which the act of raising the central power of the body takes no part. By his effort, the mind, which is a product of Kundalini as Prakriti Shakti, together with its worldly desires, is stilled, so that the veil produced by mental functioning is removed from consciousness. In Laya Yoga, Kundalini herself, when roused by the yogi, achieves for him this illumination. But why, it may be asked, should one trouble over the body and its central power, the more particularly that there are unusual risks and difficulties involved? The answer has been already given. Alleged certainty and facility of realization through the agency of the power, which is knowledge itself, that's Jnana Rupa Shakti, an intermediate acquisition of powers, that's Siddhi, and both intermediate and final enjoyment. This answer may, however, usefully be developed, as a fundamental principle of the Shakta Tantra is involved. The Shakta Tantra claims to give both enjoyment, that's bhukti, in this and the next world, and liberation, that's mukti, from all worlds. This claim is based on a profoundly true principle. If the ultimate reality is one which exists in two aspects of quiescent enjoyment of the self in liberation from all form and of active enjoyment of objects, that is, as pure spirit, and spirit in matter, then a complete union with reality demands such unity in both of its aspects. It must be known both here and there. When rightly apprehended and practiced, there is truth in the doctrine which teaches that man should make the best of both worlds. There is no real incompatibility between the two, provided action is taken in conformity with the universal law of manifestation. It is held to be false teaching that happiness hereafter can only be had by neglect to seek it now, or in deliberately sought for suffering and mortification. It is the one Shiva who is the supreme blissful experience, and who appears in the form of man with a life of mingled pleasure and pain. Both happiness here and the bliss of liberation here and hereafter may be attained if the identity of these Shivas be realized in every human act. This will be achieved by making every human function, without exception, a religious act of sacrifice and worship. In the ancient Vedic ritual, enjoyment by way of food and drink was preceded and accompanied by ceremonial sacrifice and ritual. Such enjoyment was the fruit of the sacrifice and the gift of the gods. At a higher stage in the life of a sadhaka, it is offered to the one from whom all gifts come, and of whom the devatas are inferior, limited forms. But this offering involves a dualism from which the highest monistic, that's Advaita sadhana of the Shakta Tantra, is free. Here, the individual life and the world life are known as one. And so, the Tantric sadhaka, when eating or drinking or fulfilling any other of the natural functions of the body, does so saying and believing Shivoham, meaning I am Shiva, Bhairavoham, meaning I am Bhairava, Saham, meaning I am she. It is not merely the separate individual who acts and enjoys. It is Shiva who does so in and through him. Such a one recognizes, as has been well said, that his life and the play of all its activities are not a thing apart, to be held and pursued egotistically, for its and its own separate sake, as though enjoyment was something to be seized from life by his own unaided strength and with a sense of separateness. But his life and all its activities are conceived as part of the divine action in nature, that's Shakti, manifesting and operating in the form of man. He realizes in the pulsing beat of his heart the rhythm which throbs through, and is the sign of the universal life. To neglect or to deny the needs of the body, to think of it as something not divine, is to neglect and deny that greater life of which it is a part, and to falsify the great doctrine of the unity of all, and of the ultimate identity of matter and spirit. Governed by such a concept, even the lowliest physical needs take on a cosmic significance. The body is Shakti. Its needs are Shakti's needs. When man enjoys, it is Shakti who enjoys through him. In all he sees and does, it is the mother who looks and acts. His eyes and hands are hers. The whole body and all its functions are her manifestation. To fully realize her as such is to perfect this particular manifestation of hers, which is himself. Man, when seeking to be the master of himself, so seeks on all the planes, physical, mental, and spiritual. Nor can they be severed, for they are all related, being but different aspects of the one all-pervading consciousness. Who is the more divine? He who neglects and spurns the body or mind, that he may attain some fancied spiritual superiority? Or he who rightly cherishes both as forms of the one spirit which they clothe? Realization is more speedily and truly attained by discerning spirit in and as all being and its activities, than by fleeing from and casting these aside as being either unspiritual or illusory and impediments in the path. If not rightly conceived, they may be impediments and the cause of fall. Otherwise they become instruments of attainment, and what others are there to hand. And so the Kulnarva Tantra says, by what men fall, by that they rise. When acts are done in the right feeling and frame of mind, meaning bhava, those acts give enjoyment or bhukti, and the repeated and prolonged bhava produces at length that divine experience, which is liberation. When the Mother is seen in all things, she is at length realized, as she is when beyond them all. These general principles have their more frequent application in the life of the world before entrance on the path of yoga proper. The yoga here described is, however, also an application of these same principles, insofar as it is claimed that thereby both bhukti and mukti are attained. Ordinarily it is said that where there is yoga, there is no bhoga, meaning enjoyment. But in Kaula teaching, yoga is bhoga, and bhoga is yoga, and the world itself becomes the seat of liberation. In Kundalini Yoga, enjoyment or bhoga and powers or siddhi may be had at each of the centers to which the central power is brought, and by continuance of the practice, upward, the enjoyment which is liberation may be had. By the lower processes of Hatha Yoga, it is sought to attain a perfect physical body, which will also be a wholly fit instrument by which the mind may function. A perfect mind again approaches, and in Samadhi passes into pure consciousness itself. The Hatha Yogi thus seeks a body which shall be as strong as steel, healthy, free from suffering, and therefore long-lived. Master of the body, he is master of both life and death. His lustrous form enjoys the vitality of youth. He lives as long as he has the will to live, and enjoy in the world of forms. His death is the death at will. When making the great and wonderfully expressive gesture of dissolution, he grandly departs. But it may be said, the Hatha Yogis do get sick and die. In the first place, the full discipline is one of difficulty and risk, and can only be pursued under the guidance of a skilled guru. As the Goraksha Samhita says, unaided and unsuccessful practice may lead not only to disease, but death. He who seeks to conquer the Lord of Death incurs the risk of failure of a more speedy conquest by him. All who attempt this yoga do not, of course, succeed, or meet with the same measure of success. Those who fail not only incur the infirmities of ordinary men, but others brought on by practices which have been ill pursued, or for which they are not fit. Those, again, who do succeed, do so in varying degree. One may prolong his life to the sacred age of 84, others to 100, others yet further. In theory at least, those who are perfected, that's siddha, go from this plane when they will. All have not the same capacity or opportunity through want of will, bodily strength, or circumstance. All may not be willing or able to follow the strict rules necessary for success. nor does modern life offer in general the opportunities for so complete a physical culture. All men may not desire such a life, or may think the attainment of it not worth the trouble involved. Some may wish to be rid of their body, and that as speedily as possible. It is therefore said that it is easier to gain liberation than deathlessness. The former may be had by unselfishness, detachment from the world, moral and mental discipline. But to conquer death is harder than this, for these qualities and acts will not alone avail. He who does so conquer holds life in the hollow of one hand, and if he be a successful Siddha yogi, liberation in the other. He has enjoyment and liberation. He is the emperor who is master of the world and the possessor of the bliss which is beyond all worlds. Therefore it is claimed by the Hatha Yogi that every sadhana is inferior to Hatha Yoga. The Hatha Yogi who rouses Kundalini gains various occult powers, or siddhi, and enjoyment thereby. At every center to which he leads Kundalini, he experiences a special form of bliss, meaning or ananda, and gains special powers, that siddhi. If he has vairagya, or distaste for these, he carries her to the Shiva of his cerebral center, and enjoys the supreme bliss, which is, in its nature, that of liberation, and which, when established in permanence, is liberation itself on the loosening of the spirit and body. She who shines like a chain of lights, a lightning flash, in the center of his body, is the inner woman to whom reference was made when it was said, "What need have I of any outer woman? I have an inner woman within myself." The Vira, meaning heroic sadhaka, knowing himself as the embodiment of Shiva, unites with woman as the embodiment of Shakti on the physical plane. The Divya, meaning divine sadhaka, or yogi, unites within himself his own principles, female and male, which are the heart of the Lord, or Shakti, and her Lord consciousness, or Shiva. It is their union which is the mystic coition of the Tantras. There are two forms of union, namely the first, which is the gross, or stula, or the union of the physical embodiments of the Supreme Consciousness, and the second, which is the subtle, that's shukshma, or the union of the quiescent and active principles in consciousness itself. It is the latter which is liberation. Lastly, what, in a philosophical sense, is the nature of the process here described? Shortly stated, energy, that's Shakti, polarizes itself into two forms, namely static, or potential, and dynamic as prana, the working forces of the body. Behind all activity, there is a static background. This static center in the human body is the central serpent power in the Muladhara. It is the power which is the static support of the whole body and all its moving pranic forces. This center of power is a gross form of chit, or consciousness, that is in itself, or swarupa. It is consciousness, and by appearance it is a power which, as the highest form of power, is a manifestation of it. Just as there is a distinction between the supreme, quiescent consciousness and its active power, so when consciousness manifests as energy, or Shakti, it possesses the twin aspects of potential and kinetic energy. In Advaita Vedanta, there can be no partition, in fact, of reality. To the perfect eye of its Siddha, the processes of becoming is an ascription to the ultimate real. To the eye of the sadhaka, that is, the aspirant for Siddhi, to the spirit which is still toiling through the lower planes and variously identifying itself with them, becoming is tending to appear, and appearance is real. The Shakta Tantra is a rendering of Vedantic truth from this practical point of view, and represents the world process as a polarization in consciousness itself. This polarity as it exists in and as the body is destroyed by yoga, which disturbs the equilibrium of bodily consciousness, which is the result of the maintenance of these two poles. In the human body, the potential pole of energy, which is the supreme power, is stirred to action, on which the moving forces, that's the dynamic Shakti, supported by it, are drawn thereto, and the whole dynamism thus engendered moves upward to unite with the quiescent consciousness in the highest lotus. This matter has been so well put by my friend and collaborator, Professor Pramanantha Mukhopadhyaya, and I cannot improve on his account, and therefore cite it in lieu of giving a further description on my own. When you say that Kundalini Shakti is the primordial Shakti at rest, I am led to think of an analogy in modern science. Cosmic energy in its physical aspect may be considered either as static or as dynamic, the former being a condition of equilibrium, the latter a condition of motion or change of relative position. Thus a material thing apparently at rest, that's there being no absolute rest except in pure consciousness or chit, should be regarded as energy or Shakti equilibrated, the various elements of it holding one another in check. Of course, in any given case, the equilibrium is relative rather than absolute. The important thing to note is this polarization of Shakti into two forms, static and dynamic. In the tissues of a living body, again, the operative energy, whatever the nature of that may be, whether we believe in a special vital force or not, polarizes itself into two similar forms, anabolic and catabolic, one tending to change and the other to conserve the tissues, the actual condition of the tissues being simply the resultant of these two coexistent or concurrent activities. In the mind or experience also, this polarization or polarity is patent to reflection. In my own writings, I have constantly urged this polarity between pure chit and the stress which is involved in it. There is a stress or Shakti developing the mind through an infinity of forms and changes, but all these forms and changes are known as involved in the pure and unbounded ether of awareness. This analysis therefore exhibits the primordial Shakti in the same two polar forms as before, static and dynamic, and here the polarity is more fundamental and approaches absoluteness. Lastly, let us consider for one moment the atom of modern science. The chemical atom has ceased to be an atom, that is, indivisible unit of matter. We have instead the electron theory. According to this, the so-called atom is a miniature universe, very much like our own solar system. At the center of this atomic system, we have a charge of positive electricity, round which a cloud of negative charges, called electrons, is supposed to revolve, just as myriads of planets and small bodies revolve round the sun. The positive and the negative charges hold each other in check, so that the atom is in a condition of equilibrated energy, and does not therefore ordinarily break up, though it may possibly break up and set free its equilibrated store of energy, as probably it does in the emanations of the radium. What do we notice here? The same polarity of Shakti into a static and a dynamic partner. The positive charge at rest at the center, and the negative charges in motion round about the center. A most suggestive analogy or illustration, perhaps, of the cosmic facts. The illustration may be carried into other domains of science and philosophy, but I may as well forbear going into details. For the present we may, I think, draw this important conclusion. Shakti, as manifesting itself in the universe, divides itself into two polar aspects, static and dynamic, which implies that you cannot have it in a dynamic form without at the same time having it in a corresponding static form, much like the poles of a magnet. In any given sphere of activity of force, we must have, according to this cosmic principle, a static background, Shakti at rest, or coiled, as the Tantras say. Before I proceed, let me point out what I conceive to be the fundamental significance of our Tantric and Puranic Kali. This figure, or murti, is both real and symbolic, as indeed every murti in the so-called Hindu mythology is. Now, the Divine Mother Kali is a symbol of the cosmic truth just explained. Sada Shiva, on whose breast she dances, nude and dark, is the static background of pure Chit, white and inert, because pure Chit is in itself Swarupriksha, that is, self-manifest, and Nishkriya, that is, actionless. At the same time, apart from and beyond consciousness, there can be nothing, no power or Shakti. Hence the Divine Mother stands on the bosom of the Divine Father. The Mother herself is all activity and Gunamayi. That means in her aspect as Prakriti, composed of the gunas. Her nakedness means that though she encompasses all, there is nothing to encompass herself. Her darkness means that she is inscrutable, avang manasa gochara, meaning beyond the reach of thought and speech. Of course, this is no partition of reality into two. There lies the imperfection of the Sankhya doctrine of Purusha and Prakriti, which is otherwise all right, but merely polarization in our experience of an indivisible fact, which is the primordial Shakti herself. Thus, Chit is also Shakti. Shiva is Shakti, and Shakti is Shiva, as the Tantras say. It is Gunashraya, meaning support of gunas, as well as Gunamaya, meaning whose substance is gunas. Nirguna, meaning attributeless, as well as saguna, meaning with attribute, as said in a well-known passage of the Chandi. Your suggestive hint makes the nature of the Kundalini Shakti rather clear to me. You are quite right, perhaps, in saying that the cosmic Shakti is the Samashti, meaning collectively, in relation to which the Kundalini in the bodies is only the Vyashti, meaning individual. It is an illusion, a reproduction on a miniature scale, a microcosmic plan of the whole. The law or principle of the whole, that the macrocosmic Shakti should therefore be found in the Kundalini. That law we have seen to be the law of polarization into static dynamic or potential kinetic aspects. In the living body, therefore, there must be such polarization. Now the Kundalini coiled 3.5 times at the Muladhara is the indispensable and unfailing static background of the dynamic Shakti operating in the whole body, carrying on processes and working out changes. The body, therefore, may be compared to a magnet with 2 poles. The Muladhara is the static pole in relation to the rest of the body, which is dynamic, the working. The body necessarily presupposes and finds such a static support, hence perhaps the name Muladhara, the fundamental support. In one sense, the static Shakti at the Muladhara is necessarily coexistent with the creating and evolving Shakti of the body, because the dynamic aspect or pole can never be without its static counterpart. In another sense, it is the Shakti left over after Prithvi, the last of the Bhutas, has been created, a magazine of power to be drawn upon and utilized for further activity, if there should arise any need for such. Taking the 2 senses together, yours as well as mine, Shakti at the Muladhara is both coexistent with every act of creation or manifestation, and is the residual effect of such act, both cause and effect. In fact, an idea which, deeply looked into, shows no real contradiction. There is, in fact, what the physicist will describe as a cycle of circuit in action. Let us take the impregnated ovum, the earliest embryological stage of the living body. In it, the Kundalini Shakti is already present in its 2 polar aspects. The ovum, which the mother element represents, one pole, possibly the static, and the spermatozoon, which is the father element, represents the other, possibly the dynamic. From their fusion proceed those processes which the biologist calls differentiation and integration. But in all this process of creation, the cycle can be fairly easily traced. Shakti flows out of the germinal cell, that's the fertilized ovum, seizes upon foreign matter and assimilates it, and thereby grows in bulk, divides and subdivides itself, and then again coordinates all its divided parts into one organic whole. Now, in all this, we have the cycle. Seizing upon foreign matter is an outwardly directed activity. Assimilation is an inwardly directed activity, or return current. Cell division and multiplication is an outwardly directed operation. Coordination is inwardly directed, and so on. The force in the germ cell is overflowing. but also continuously it is flowing back into itself, the two operations presupposing and sustaining each other, as in every circuit. The given stock of force in the germ cell, which is static so long as the fusion of the male and female elements does not take place in the womb, is the necessary starting point of all creative activity. It is the primordial cause, therefore, in relation to the body, primordial as well as constantly given unceasing. On the other hand, the reaction of every creative action, the return current or flowing back of every unfolding overflow, constantly renews this starting force, changes it without changing its general condition of relative equilibrium. The force in the germ cell may therefore also be regarded as a perpetual effect, something left over and set against the working forces of the body. Many apparently inconsistent ideas enter into this conception, and they have to be reconciled. 1. We start with a force in the germ cell, which is statical at first, though, like a dicotyledon seed, or even a modern atom, it involves within itself both a statical and a dynamical pole, otherwise from pure rest involving no possibility of motion, no motion could ever arise. Let this be the Kundalini coiled. 2. Then there is creative impulse arising out of it. This is motion out of rest. By this, the Kundalini becomes partly static and partly dynamic, or ejects, so to say, a dynamic pole out of it in order to evolve the body, but remaining a static pole or background itself all along. In no part of the process has the Kundalini really uncoiled itself altogether, or even curtailed its 3 coils and a half. Without this Muladhara Shakti remaining intact, no evolution could be possible at all. It is the hinge upon which everything else turns. 3. Each creative act again reacts on the Muladhara Shakti, so that such reaction, without disturbing the relative rest of the coiled Shakti, changes its volume or intensity, but does not curtail or add to the number of coils. For instance, every natural act of respiration reacts on the coiled Shakti at the Muladhara, but it does not commonly make much difference. But pranayama powerfully reacts on it, so much so that it awakes the dormant power and sends it piercing through the centers. Now, the common description that the Kundalini uncoils herself then and goes up the Shushumna, leaving the Muladhara, should, I think, be admitted with caution. That static background can never be absolutely dispensed with. As you have yourself rightly observed, Shakti can never be depleted, but this is how to look at it. Precisely, the Kundali, when powerfully worked upon by yoga, sends forth an emanation or ejection in the likeness of her own self, which pierces through the various centers until it becomes blended, as you point out, with the Maha Kundali of Shiva at the highest or 7th center. Thus, while this ethereal double of self-ejection of the coiled power at the Muladhara ascends the Shushumna, the coiled power itself does not and need not stir from its place. It is like a spark given from an oversaturated electromagnetic machine, or rather, it is like the emanations of radium, which do not sensibly detract from the energy contained in it. This last, perhaps, is the closest physical parallel of the case that we are trying to understand. As a well-known passage in the Upanishad has it, the whole, that's Purana, is subtracted from the whole, and yet the whole remains. I think our present case comes very near to this. The Kundalini at the Muladhara is the whole primordial Shakti in monad or germ or latency. That is why it is coiled. The Kundalini that mounts up the Nadi is also the whole Shakti in a specifically dynamic form, an eject likeness of the eternal spirit. The result of the last fusion in the Sahasrara is also the whole, or Purna. This is how I look at it. In this conception, the permanent static background is not really depleted, much less is it dispensed with. 4. When again I say that the volume or intensity of the coiled power can be affected, though not its configuration and relative equilibrium, I do not mean to throw up the principle of conservation of energy in relation to the Kundalini, which is the embodiment of all energy. It is merely the conversion of static or potential energy into dynamic or kinetic energy in part, the sum remaining constant. As we have to deal with infinities here, an exact physical rendering of this principle is not to be expected. The yogi therefore simply awakens and never creates Shakti. By the way, the germ cell which evolves the body does not, according to modern biology, cease to be a germ cell in any stage of the complicated process. The original germ cell splits up into two. One half gradually develops itself into the body of a plant or animal. This is the somatic cell. The other half remains encased within the body, practically unchanged, and is transmitted in the process of reproduction to the offspring, that is, the germ plasm. Now this germ plasm is unbroken through the whole line of propagation. This is Wiseman's doctrine of continuity of the germ plasm, which has been widely accepted, though it is but a hypothesis. In a subsequent postscript, the professor wrote, 1. Shakti being either static or dynamic, every dynamic form necessarily presupposes a static background. A purely dynamic activity, which is motion in its physical aspect, is impossible without a static support or ground. Hence, the philosophical doctrine of absolute motion or change, as taught by old Heraclitus and the Buddhists, and by modern Bergson, is wrong. It is based neither upon correct logic nor upon clear intuition. The constitution of an atom reveals the static dynamic polarization of Shakti. Other and more complex forms of existence also do the same. In the living body, this necessary static background is Muladhara, where Shakti is Kundalini coiled. All the functional activity of the body, starting from the development of the germ cell, is correlated to and sustained by the Shakti concentrated at the Muladhara. Cosmic creation too, ending with the evolution of Prithvi Tattva, also presupposes a cosmic static background over and above Chidaksha, ether of consciousness, which is the Maha Kundalini Shakti in the Chinmaya Deha, meaning body of consciousness, of Parameshvara or Parameshvari, meaning the Supreme Lord in male and female aspect. In the earliest stage of creation, when the world arises in divine consciousness, it requires as the principle or pole of Tat, meaning that, the correlate principle or pole of Aham, meaning I. In the development of the former, the latter serves as a static background. In our own experiences too, a-perception, or consciousness of self, is the sustaining background, a string, so to say, which holds together all the loose beads of our elements of feeling. The sustaining ground, or adhara, as the seat of static force, therefore is found, in one form or another, in every phase and stage of creative evolution. The absolute or ultimate form is, of course, Chit Shakti, meaning consciousness as power, itself the unfailing light of awareness, about which our Gayatri mantra says, which sustains and impels all the activities of buddhi. This fact is symbolized by the Kali Murti, not a mere symbol, however. 2. My remarks about the rising or awakening of the serpent power at the Muladhara have been, perhaps, almost of the nature of a paradox. The coiled power, though awakened, uncoiling and rising, never really stirs from its place. Only a sort of ethereal double, or eject, is unloosed and sent up through the system of centers. Now, in plain language, this ethereal double or eject means the dynamic equivalent of the static power concentrated at the mula, or root. Whenever, by pranayama of bija mantra or any other suitable means, the Muladhara becomes like an electromagnetic machine, oversaturated, though the Kundalini Shakti at the Mula is infinite and exhaustless, yet the capacity of a given finite organism to contain it in a static form is limited, and therefore there may be oversaturation. So whenever it's oversaturated, a dynamic or operative equivalent of the static power is set up, possibly by a law similar to nature's law of induction, by which the static power itself is not depleted or rendered other than static. It is not that static energy at the mula wholly passes over into a dynamic form, the coiled kundalini leaving the mula, thus making it void. That cannot be. And were it so, all dynamic operation in the body would cease directly for want of a background. The coiled power remains coiled or static, and yet something apparently passes out of the mula, the dynamic equivalent. This paradox can perhaps be explained in two ways. The first, one explanation was suggested in my main letter. The potential Kundalini Shakti becomes partly converted into kinetic Shakti, and yet, since Shakti, even as given in the Mula center, is an infinitude, it is not depleted. The potential store always remains unexhausted. I referred to a passage in the Upanishad about Purna. In this case, the dynamic equivalent is a partial conversion of one mode of energy into another. In Laya Yoga here described, it is ordinarily so. When, however, the infinite potential becomes an infinite kinetic, when, that is to say, the coiled power of the mula becomes absolutely uncoiled, we have necessarily the dissolution of the three bodies, that's Stula, Linga, and Karana, gross, subtle, causal, and consequently Videha Mukti, meaning bodiless liberation. Because the static background in relation to a particular form of existence has now wholly given way, according to our hypothesis. But Maha Kundalini remains. Hence, individual mukti, meaning liberation, need not mean dissolution of samsara, meaning transmigrating worlds, itself. Commonly, however, as the Tantra says, pitva, pitva, puna pitva. And the other explanation is suggested by a law of induction. Take an electromagnetic machine. If a suitable substance is placed near it, it will induce it in an equivalent and opposite kind of electromagnetism, without losing its own stock of energy. In conduction, energy flows over into another thing, so that the source loses and the other thing gains what it has lost, and its gain is similar in kind to the loss. Not so induction. There, the source does not lose, and the induced energy is equivalent and opposite in kind to the inducing energy. Thus, a positive change will induce an equivalent negative charge in the neighboring object. Now, shall we suppose that the Muladhara, when it becomes oversaturated, induces in the neighboring center, say Swadhisthana, a dynamic, that's not static, equivalent? Is this what the rise of the Serpent Power really means? The explanation, I am tempted to think, is not perhaps altogether fantastic. In reply to this highly interesting and illustrative account of my friend, I wrote suggesting some difficulties in the way of the acceptance of his statement that Kundalini Shakti did not in fact herself uncoil and ascend, but projected upwards an emanation in the likeness of her own self. The difficulty I felt was this. In the first place, the yoga books, to which full credence must be given in this matter, unequivocally affirm that Kundalini herself does in fact ascend. This is borne out by some inquiries made of a Tantric Pandit very familiar with his Shastra, after the receipt of the letter quoted. As the body of the yogi still lives, though in an inert, corpse-like condition, when consciousness of it is lost, I asked him how the body was sustained when Kundalini left her central abode. His answer was that it was maintained by the nectar which flows from the union of Shiva and Shakti in the Sahasrara. This nectar is an ejection of power generated by their union. If Kundalini does not ascend, but a mere emanation spark of her, how, he further asked, is it that the body becomes cold and corpse-like? Would this follow if the power still remained at its center, and merely sent forth a dynamic equivalent of itself? There were further difficulties in that theory, put forward by my friend, though it may be that there are also difficulties in the acceptance of the statement that the Muladhara is entirely depleted of the great power. I suggested that Kundalini was the static center of the whole body as a complete conscious organism, and that each of the parts of the body and their constituent cells must have their own static centers, which would uphold such parts and cells, and that the life of the body as a collection of material particles was sustained by the nectar which flowed from Kundalini Shakti when in union with Shiva at the Sahasrara. In reply, Professor P. Mukyodabhyadya dealt with the matter as follows. According to my presentation of the case, something, a dynamic equivalent or operative double, is certainly sent forth from the Muladhara, but this basic center or seat is not depleted or rendered void of static energy in consequence of that operation. The Mula, as the seat of static or coiled power, can never be dispensed with. It is the sine qua non of all functions of the triple body, that's gross, subtle, and causal bodies. It is, so to say, the buffer or base against which any activity of the jiva must react or recoil, like a naval or any other kind of heavy gun against its base or emplacement. Thus, while the dynamic or uncoiled Shakti ascends the axis, the static or coiled Shakti retains its place at the Mula and remains as the very possibility of the dynamic upheaval. The ascending power is simply the dynamic counterpart of the static ground. To say that Kundalini leaves its place and ascends is only to say that it ceases to be Kundalini and becomes dynamic. The ascending power is therefore uncoiled or non-Kundalini power. It is the dynamic expression of the Kundalini power. So far, all can agree. But the question is the Mula depleted or deprived of all power, especially coiled power, when that dynamical expression leaves it and ascends the axis? Is the dynamic expression wholly at the expense of the static ground? Should the latter cease in order that the former may commence? Here, I think, I must answer in the negative. It is a case of power leaving as well as remaining, leaving as dynamic and remaining as static. It is the case of the Kundali being uncoiled in one aspect or pole and remaining still coiled in another aspect or pole. A paradox, perhaps, but like most paradoxes, it is likely to be true. Is scriptural authority, which, by the by, I hold in utmost reverence, really challenged by this interpretation? The nature of the dynamic equivalent and its relation to the static background have been indicated in the previous two communications, and I need not dilute them. I have claimed throughout that the Muladhara, as the seat of static, that's coiled, power, can never be rendered a vacuum in relation to such power, except in the circumstances of videya mukti, meaning bodiless liberation, when the triple body, that's gross, subtle, and causal body, must dissolve. I think, also, that the point of view which you have taken can be reconciled with this interpretation of the matter. The Kundalini Shakti is the static aspect of the life of the whole organized body, as you say rightly. The relation between the lives of the individual cells and that of the whole organism is not clearly understood in science. Is the common life a merely mechanical resultant of the lives of the individual cells? Or are the lives of the individual cells only detailed manifestations of the common life? In other words, is the common life cause and the cell lives effects, or vice versa? Science is not yet settled on this point. As a subscriber to Shaktivada, meaning doctrine of Shakti, I am inclined, however, to give primacy to the common life. In the germ cell itself, the common life is given in substance, and the whole development of the Jiva Deha, meaning Jiva body, is only the detailed carrying out in particulars of what has been already given in substance, according to the principle of adrishta, meaning karma. Nevertheless, I am quite willing to concede to the individual cell lives of semi-independence. Semi, because they require to be sustained to a considerable degree by the life of the whole. Benefit or injury to the life of the whole reacts on the condition of the cells. The death of the whole life is followed by the death of the cells, and so on. Now, in every cell there is, of course, static dynamic polarity. In the whole organism also there is such polarity or correlation. In the whole organism, the static pole or correlate is the coiled power at the Muladhara, and the dynamic correlate is the operative power, that is, the 5 pranas: Prana, Apana, Samana, Udana, and Dhyana, which actually carries on the various functions of the body. Ordinarily, therefore, this dynamic power is distributed over the whole body, vitalizing not merely the larger tissues, but the microscopic cells. Now, the devitalization of the body in Kundalini Yoga, or Shat-chakra bheda, is due, I venture to think, not to the depletion or privitation of the static power at the Muladhara, but to the concentration or convergence of the dynamic power ordinarily diffused over the whole body, so that the dynamic equivalent, which is set up against the static background or Kundalini Shakti, is only diffused 5-fold prana gathered home, withdrawn from the other tissues of the body, and concentrated in a line along the axis. Thus, ordinarily, the dynamic equivalent is the prana diffused over all the tissues. In yoga, it is converged along the axis, the static equivalent or Kundalini Shakti enduring in both cases. Thus also the polarity or correlation is maintained. In the former case, between Shakti at Muladhara and the diffused prana. In the latter case, between Shakti at Mula and the converged prana along the axis. This will perhaps adequately explain coldness, increased inertia, insensibility, and so on of the rest of the body in Kundalini Yoga, of which you write. Commonly in yoga, this withdrawal and convergence of prana is incomplete. The residual prana, together with the lives of the cells, keeps the body alive, though inert or corpse-like. In the case of complete withdrawal and focusing, the cells will die and the body will disintegrate. On the other hand, if the coiled power was simply and wholly uncoiled, that is, dynamized, in Kundalini Yoga, then there should be an excess rather than a defect of vitality all over the body. Nothing would be subtracted from the already available dynamic energy of the body, but something would be added to it on account of the static power at the Mula being rendered kinetic and going up the axis and influencing neighboring tissues. Hence, I should venture to conclude that the static power at the base of the axis, without itself being depleted or rendered other than static, induces or produces a dynamic equivalent, which is the diffused prana of the body gathered and converged along the axis. The states in the process may thus be summarily indicated. 1. To begin with, there is coiled power at the base of the axis, and its necessary correlate, the dynamic prana, diffused all over the body in the 5 forms. 2. In Kundalini Yoga, some part of the already available dynamic prana is made to act at the base of the axis in a suitable manner, by which means the base, or particularly the 4 petaled Padma lotus, which represents the center, becomes oversaturated and reacts on the whole diffused dynamic power, or prana, of the body, by withdrawing it from the tissues and converging it along the line of the axis. In this way, the diffused dynamic equivalent becomes the converged dynamic equivalent along the axis. This is what the rising of the serpent perhaps means. Subcategory A. In thus reacting, the coiled power has not lost its general equilibrium or static condition. B. The modus operandi of this reaction is difficult to indicate, but it is probably, as suggested in my previous communications, either a partial conversion of the infinite coiled power into the sort of influence that can thus gather the diffused prana and converge in it its own resultant line along the axis, or an indicative action, analogous to electromagnetic action, by which the pranas are collected and converged. In this latter case, there is no need for conversion of the static energy. We shall have perhaps to choose between, or rather coordinate, these two explanations in understanding the modus operandi. In mathematical language, the diffused prana is a scalar quantity, that is, having magnitude but no direction, while the converged prana is a vector quantity, that is, having both magnitude and definite direction. Suppose lastly we are witnessing with a divya chakshu, meaning inner eye, the progress of Kundalini Yoga. There something like condensed lightning is rising from the Muladhara and gathering momentum in going up from chakra to chakra, till the consummation is reached at the Parama Shiva Sthana, meaning abode of the Supreme Shiva. But look back, and behold the Kula Kundalini is also there at the Mula, coiled 3 times and a half round the Swayambhu Linga. She has left, and yet remained or stayed, and is again coming back to herself. Is not this vision supported by scriptural authority and the experience of the yogi? Putting aside detail, the main principles appear to be that when awakened, Kundalini Shakti either herself, or as my friend suggests in her eject, ceases to be static power, which sustains the world consciousness, the content of which is held only so long as she sleeps, and when once set in motion is drawn to that other static center in the 1,000-petaled lotus, that's the Sahasrara, which is herself in union with the Shiva consciousness, or the consciousness of ecstasy beyond the world of forms. When Kundalini sleeps, man is awake to this world. When she awakes, he sleeps, that is, loses all consciousness of the world and enters his causal body. In yoga, he passes beyond to the formless consciousness. I have only to add, without further discussion of the point, that practitioners of this yoga claim that it is higher than any other, and that the samadhi, meaning ecstasy attained thereby, is more perfect. The reason which they allege is this. In Dhyana yoga, ecstasy takes place through detachment from the world and mental concentration, leading to vacuity of mental operation, or vritti, of the uprising of pure consciousness unhindered by the limitations of the mind. The degree to which this unveiling of consciousness is effected depends upon the meditative powers, that is, jnana shakti, of the sadhaka, and the extent of his detachment from the world. On the other hand, Kundalini, who is all Shaktis, and who is therefore Jnana Shakti itself, produces, when awakened by the yogi, full jnana for him. Secondly, in the Samadhi of Dhyana Yoga, there is no rousing and union of Kundalini Shakti, with the accompanying bliss and acquisition of special powers, or siddhi. Further, in Kundalini Yoga, there is not merely a Samadhi through meditation, but through the central power of the jiva, a power which carries with it the forces of both body and mind. The union in that sense is claimed to be more complete than that enacted through mental methods only, though in both cases bodily consciousness is lost. In Kundalini Yoga, not only the mind, but the body, insofar as it is represented by its central power, is actually united with Shiva. This union produces an enjoyment, that's bhukti, which the Dhyana yogi does not possess. Whilst both the Divya yogi and the Vira sadhaka have enjoyment, that of the former is infinitely more intense, being an experience of bliss itself. The enjoyment of the Vira sadhaka is but a reflection of it on the physical plane, a welling up of the true bliss through the deadening coverings and trammels of matter. Again, whilst it is said that both have liberation, or mukti, this word is used in Vira sadhana in a figurative sense only, indicating a bliss which is the nearest approach on the physical plane to that of mukti, and a bhava, or feeling of momentary union of Shiva and Shakti, which ripens in the higher yoga sadhana into the literal liberation of the yogi. He, in its fullest sense, has both enjoyment and liberation. Hence its claim to be the emperor of all yogas. However this may be, I leave at this point the subject, with the hope that others will continue the inquiry I have here initiated. It and other matters in the Tantra Shastra seem to me, whatever be their inherent value, worthy of an investigation which they have not yet received. This concludes the introductory chapters to the Shat-chakra-nirupana.